Hey everybody, it's Bob from Garage Dwellers Woodworking, and in this video I'm going to show you how I made something that wound up being a little bit more than just your standard little library. Now, I was initially approached by a client who wanted a little library for their gym. It is the jiu-jitsu gym that I go to, and they have a lot of kids that come through. We have a kids class. Obviously, there are kids hanging around when the adult classes are running, so they wanted something where kids could, take a book, leave a book, that little library kind of concept. Now, if you're not familiar with the little libraries, these things popped up all over the place during the pandemic, and most of them were just kind of a standard kind of 2x2 box. Some of them had a little angled roof. Some of them looked like houses. Most of them were propped up on a stick, and most of them were made with pretty basic construction lumber, kind of whatever people could get their hands on. And when the client first talked to me about doing this, I told them I wanted to try to make something just a little bit more, make it a little bit nicer, a little bit bigger, add a little bit more functionality to it. So as with every project, we start with breakdown of our materials, and what you saw me doing there first was using the TSO parallel guides to make nice repeatable rips in this maple plywood. Here I'm using my MFT outfeed assembly bench, which if you haven't seen the videos for that build and you're interested, when you're done watching this, you can check out. I'll leave a link in the description for those. I've got this plywood set up. You can see it's a pretty long piece. I have a roller outfeed support off the edge of the bench there where I'm setting this up against. And then I'm using the Bench Dogs UK MFT fence system. And this is a really nice fence setup. You can see it's got a stop so that I can make nice repeatable cuts. This has been a game changer for me in terms of being able to break down plywood and supplies. You can see how easy it is to use. Now for the bottom divider and the middle divider for this bookshelf little library thing, I decided I wanted to sandwich two pieces of plywood together, and I had to be very careful because this maple plywood was maple on one side and birch on the other, and obviously I want the show faces to be the maple. So I made very sure before I applied a liberal amount of glue here that I had the maple side facing out and the birch side facing in for the glue up. Now you can see here I'm gluing these two together with clamps. And another important thing, I always try to stress this, and if you've seen any of my videos before, you have probably heard me say this, but I think it's really important not to put too much pressure on your clamps. You do not need clamps to have thousands of pounds of pressure squeezing down on them. You just need enough pressure for some good glue squeeze out, and we got that here. You also don't want to squeeze so hard that you dent your plywood. Now, the next thing that I did before coming to the table saw here is I actually took these over to the joiner, and I almost never use plywood on a joiner. In fact, you should almost never use plywood on a joiner. But I first used a chisel to clean up any glue squeeze out on one long edge, and then set the depth of that joiner to the absolute bare minimum just to make sure everything was cleaned out and level to reference against the table saw fence. I then set for the depth of my dividers and ran those all through. I actually ran the side pieces through as well so that I could get a nice consistent depth for the entire bookshelf. And then here I am using my crosscut sled to go ahead and cut all of these dividers to the appropriate width. First, I make a pass with the dividers not against the stop on the crosscut sled. I flip it 180 degrees, put it up against that stop, and then do this for all of the different dividers, and it makes nice, repeatable, perfectly sized and evenly matched dividers so that the bookshelf construction should go together pretty easily. Now here you see me starting that construction for the bookshelf, and what I did first was I marked a center line. You can see I put both of my side panels up next to each other so that I could scribe that line at the same time. I then took my laminated middle divider and put the glue line on that line and marked out the edges of that so I knew exactly where to put my glue. Now this is my favorite way to put plywood cabinetry like this or a plywood bookshelf like this together. I put the glue down, and of course glue is definitely going to work with plywood. Half of your edge is going to be long grain, half is going to be edge grain because of the way plywood is constructed. So you definitely want glue, but you also want supports during gluing. So I like to use a brad nailer. I love the brad nailer, obviously. It makes me feel like Norm Abrams every time I use it. I use it whenever I can, sometimes even when I don't need to, just because I think it's fun. But I go ahead and use the brad nailer to attach the side pieces there. You can see I get good glue squeeze out with a little bit of pressure there. And I'm making sure at every step that I am at 90 degrees. These brad nails are temporarily holding things together until I can get everything glued up, and they hold everything in place so I don't get any slippage and everything stays at 90 degrees. So again, finger tight pressure here with the clamps. Don't need anything to be super, super tight. You can see right there on the end, good glue squeeze out, and that's really the name of the game in any glue up, no matter what kind of wood you're working with. You want nice, even glue squeeze out. So now you can see how the bookshelf is starting to take shape. We've got the top divider, which is 1 piece of plywood thick, and then we have the middle and bottom dividers, which are 2 pieces of plywood thick. Now, once the glue had time to tack up, I came back and decided to reinforce all this with screws. Again, I just want this to be nice and sturdy and make sure that I've got things as stout as it can be. So I put a screw in first near the top of the dividers so that I could make sure I was staying in the middle. You don't want to blow through the top or the bottom of your dividers at this point. And then once I had done that in all 3 of the dividers, I took a T-square and drew a reference line so that I could then make sure that all the rest of my screws were in the correct place. These will all be covered up with trim later. So for the top portion, I wanted to save a little bit of plywood, and I was going to put a hardwood top on this, so I decided to make a little web frame here with some scraps from the plywood. You can see at the table saw, I first went ahead and ripped some narrow strips, and I used my workpiece as a reference to then make a mark, come over to the miter saw here, and cut it to the exact width. Now, I think this is an important woodworking tip, and if you are a newer woodworker, this is something that will change how you woodwork. This is something that I found early on in woodworking really made my woodworking much more accurate. The traditional way that I would do this is I would take a tape measure, and I would measure the width of that. I would go to my piece of plywood, take the tape measure, drag it across there, make my mark, cut to my line, and it would either be too long or, in some cases, unfortunately, too short, no matter how many times I measured. Sometimes you can measure 3 times, cut once, and you still screw things up. So what I found is, especially if you're working off plans, things aren't always exactly as the plans are drawn up. I'm not working with plans here, but in general, I like to just use the actual workpiece as a reference surface. So for here, instead of measuring the width of the bookshelf, I just took my piece, set it up flush against one edge, then used a pencil to make a mark directly off that, and then I can use the miter saw to sneak up on the fit. You can see again here I apply a thin strip of glue and then just adding some brad nails to hold everything in place. That will do more than fine. You can see here again I am demonstrating the same thing. When I come to put these cross pieces in this web frame, I hold it up against my 2 long pieces, make a direct reference, and this was first try. Not bragging, but that was pretty good. So I would highly advise you try that if you don't do that already. And then for the rest of these, it was the same process, little strip of glue, set it in place, brad nails, and we were good to go. So now that my case was generally constructed, it was time to start milling up some soft maple. I like soft maple quite a bit. It is a little bit cheaper around me than hard maple, and in terms of color and performance, I personally haven't noticed much of a difference. And the goal here was to put some faux panels on the side. Some of you may have been wondering when you saw me putting screws into the outside surface of that plywood panel how I was going to cover that up, or if I was just going to leave those exposed. If you've seen me build any of my furniture, you should know better than that. There's no exposed screws here. So we're going to use some soft maple trim to go ahead and create a faux panel look. Now, one thing that's important here is I wanted the thickness of my maple to match up with the thickness of the plywood. And an important tip, again, especially if you're a newer woodworker, a lot of times plywood is listed in common dimensions, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch if you're in the States. But it's rarely, if ever, actually that thickness. It's usually a fraction of an inch thinner. So I took a reference piece of plywood over to the planer with me, and I used that to ultimately set the thickness of these maple strips. Next step, of course, was to go over to the table saw and rip them down into the proper width. I ripped these all to 1.5 inches wide, and you're going to see here in a minute how I'm going to use these to go ahead and make up a faux panel. So starting out with these side pieces, again, you'll notice I'm doing the same thing. I'm starting with these outside longer strips. I actually hold them up to my workpiece, make a reference line there, and I cut to the exact dimensions that I need. I can use the table saw to sneak up on the fit if I want to. Now, for a lot of the rest of this project, you are going to see me using Titebond Quick and Thick. And Titebond Quick and Thick is a great glue I have found, especially for doing face frames and trim work like this. True to its name, it is very quick in terms of its dry time. You can start working with the pieces, 15, 20 minutes after. And the thickness of it, the viscosity of the glue actually holds things in place. So as I put the glue on and set the trim piece in place here, that glue is really tacky and holds it in place. Now what you see me doing here is I'm using a stop block to give me a 1/4 inch overhang. For the back panel for this bookshelf, I am going to be putting a piece of 1/4 inch maple plywood on there. So on the back, I want a little bit of a 1/4 inch overhang. You'll see here in a little bit when I build the base toe kick for this bookshelf, I overhang that in the back a 1/4 inch as well so that everything flushes up. So again, setup blocks are one of those things that I always encourage people to get if they can for their shops. Setup blocks are a very useful tool, and if you have a nice set of them, I think it's highly important that you do what I just did and make sure you drop them from standing height, and then take the hose from your compressor and make sure that you hit your nice camera with it and bounce that around. It's always important to destroy nice things as much as you can. So for a little added protection here, I went ahead and added some clamps. There's always the saying about woodworkers always needing more clamps, and when I first started, I didn't have these, and I have found these small Pony Jorgensen clamps to be a really nice thing to have around. I use them for way more stuff than I thought I would. Any company makes them. I just happened to get these particular ones. I would highly advise that you guys check them out if you need some extra clamping, especially small clamping around your shop. So again, you're going to see me doing the same thing. Lather, rinse, and repeat. Put a strip of glue on, put the trim on, use some brad nails to hold it in place, and then I followed up with clamps. And then here you see me putting the cross sections, and hopefully you can see as you look back through the shot there, I went ahead and set a piece of trim right in the middle. So this is ultimately going to look like a panel. So glued it up, brad nailed it in place, and now we had the trim all set for the sides of the cabinet. Now that these side panels are starting to take shape, it was time to put the face frame on, and hopefully you guys can see now all of our screws are covered, and this plywood, this edge of the plywood is going to be covered up ultimately with some face framing material here. Now, I thought I would show you a little bit of a different technique. When I was planning this build, I wanted to go ahead and show this anyway, and then I posted some videos on Instagram of me putting those side panels in, and I got a couple different questions about why I was trying to cut it to length beforehand, and was there any other way to do that? And yes, there is. So you can see here again, putting a little strip of glue on there, smearing it around, and I actually left this piece long. I'm going to come back with a flush trim saw, and here's another tip for you. With these long pieces of trim, even if you did everything properly in your milling, when you rip them down, it is going to release some tension, and they are going to bow and move a little bit. So with my brad nails and my attachment of these, I always like to start at one end, nail my way up to the other end, and make sure that I am getting them all flush with the plywood so I don't have to come back and trim everything up later. Again, these were cut to be specifically the same thickness as those 2 layers of wood that we had on the side, the same thickness as the top and bottom laminated dividers. And you can see here, I'm using a flush trim saw. Probably could have used my bigger saw for this, so that's why it's so sped up, but you get the idea. Now, of course, like I mentioned before, this is both maple on one side and birch on the other side plywood, and so I wanted to cover up this birch, so I got myself some 1/4 inch maple plywood, went ahead and set some glue, cut the pieces of 1/4 inch to the exact dimensions that I need, leaving a little bit of a gap so that I've got some wiggle room, but trying to keep them as tight as possible. If you've ever worked with 1/4 inch plywood, you know it tends to sort of pretzel up a little bit. So what you saw me doing there was putting some 23 gauge pins around the edges to tack everything down while that glue dried. And again, I'm going to come back later with some small trim and cover that up. The goal here is to not have anything visible in terms of hardware and that includes our nail holes. So now that the general case was completely constructed, including my trim, it was time to put together the toe kick box for the bottom of this. I wanted this so that it was up off the floor, and so that if the floor was super uneven, again, this was going into a gym, I wanted to be able to have something that I could attach leveling feet to adjust and make sure that this thing would sit level. And again, just wanted to give it a little bit of elevation off of the floor. So for the front of the box that would be visible, I went ahead and did mitered corners with that. On the back, I just did a butt joint, and you can see pocket holes here. Pocket holes, of course, one of the hot topics in woodworking. That's how exciting woodworkers are. We debate pocket holes. This is a great application for pocket holes, though. It's a perfect place for it. Easy to remove later on if I need to. Not something anybody's going to see. And did a great job of attaching this toe kick box to the bottom of the cabinet. You can see I left a little bit of a recess there on the front, and the back of it is flush with the back trim pieces. So again, overhangs the back a 1/4 inch so that I can accept that 1/4 inch plywood panel for the back of the shelf later. Now what you see me doing here is drilling some shelf pin holes, and this shelf pin hole jig is super simple. I got it at Woodcraft. It is cheap. One of the important things when you are setting up shelf pins is to make sure that you are doing everything the right way. What I just said there was 37, and I'm trying to reference these 37 millimeters from the front and the back. You could see if I flipped my jig end over end and drilled those holes, they would not match up. So you have to be very careful when using a jig like this. The last thing you want to do is drill a bunch of holes, make your project look like Swiss cheese, and then get to the end of it and realize that you haven't lined up all the right holes and that your shelves aren't going to fit properly. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that I didn't want any visible hardware or any evidence of any visible hardware. So I went ahead and went around all of the pin holes and all of the brad nail holes that were visible. If there was anything where the brad nail was a little proud of the surface, I used a nail set and set that to just below the surface. And then I'm coming around with some wood filler here and filling in all those tiny little holes. If you are doing something paint grade, for instance, you would be painting this cabinet. There's a lot of different other projects. If you're using pre-painted trim or anything that's kind of already painted or pre-primed and ready to go, there's a lot of different substances and sticks that you can use to rub on to these little holes that will fill them in. But for this, I'm going to be finishing it, so I want to have something that matches. I got some maple wood filler, and it worked out really well. Unless you get right up on them, you really can't see it. So here, once that all dried, I'm going around and sanding all of that flush, and I took this opportunity to really kind of get everything to 150 grit. That is where I generally stop with sanding, and then before I put my trim pieces on the inside of these faux panels, I went ahead and put a nice soft round over on there, again, just to ease the look a little bit and to prevent any sharp corners from the touch. So now it was time to make some of the trim, and what I did for this is I started by taking some scrap strips of maple that I had, went over to the router table with a chamfering bit. I took a nice first pass here, not taking too thick of a pass, and then came back for a cleanup pass. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the table saw, and I'm going to cut a strip of this off with the chamfered edge to the left of my saw blade. Now, down in the right side of the table saw fence there, you can see a mag switch. This is a magnetic switch, and I have used this as a marker for where I need to push my already routed piece of maple up against so that I can cut nice, repeatable, precise size trim. You can see here the next piece that I brought in was a little bit narrower. All I have to do is set it up against that mag switch. I bring the fence right up against it, and now again I can cut a nice, repeatable width and size piece of trim. We actually have a 10% off code for MagSwitch, and they have a ton of great products. They have these magnetic blocks. They've got magnetic featherboards. They have stuff whether you're into woodworking, metalworking, whatever. So check out the link down in the description of this video. You click on that link, and then you use the code DWELLERS10. That'll get you 10% off MagSwitch products, and it helps us out a little bit, so check it out. So once I had these pieces cut, took them to the table saw with a 45-degree miter jig and took nice, slow passes. These are really small pieces. I had a higher tooth blade in the table saw, and even with that, there was still a little bit of chatter. So I wanted to be really careful not to blow these things out. And the nice thing, again, with this Titebond Quick and Thick is set them in place, and I really, except for a couple spots where I put some blue tape, Didn't have to do any kind of clamping whatsoever. Now, whenever I'm doing an interior trim like this, I always like to put the top and the bottom trim first, and then measure my side pieces of trim. I find that if you go in a clockwise or counterclockwise direction, it just doesn't always work out as well as it should, and your pieces don't always fit like they should. So I like to go top and bottom first, then put the side pieces in, and these things fit really nicely. And again, the setup with that mag switch made things work out really, really well. I got great results on this trim. Now, I'm sure that there's at least somebody watching this who's wondering, hey, at the start of the video, you said that this started off as a little library concept. Don't most little libraries have doors and it looks like you're just building a plywood bookshelf? Well, I'm getting to it, okay? So here I am taking some maple trim and cutting the rails and stiles for the top portion of this bookshelf little library thing, and these are going to be the cabinet doors. You can see here, as always, whenever I can set up a stop block and do repeatable cuts with all of my tasks that are the same at once, I do so. This gets you nice, even, consistent results. Your stop blocks do not have to be as nice as an inlaid track at your miter station. There's a lot of different ways you can get this accomplished. Now, speaking of a lot of different ways to get things accomplished, I'm going to be using the domino to put these doors together. There's a lot of different ways you could do this. Coping bits at the router table, dowels, you could do mitered joints, we could do spline mitered joints, we could do half laps, all sorts of different stuff. The domino is one of my favorite ways to make shaker style doors, and that's what we were going for here. I have, you can see on the bottom of the domino there, a little portion that's got some tabs that allow for nice repeatable mortises. And as you can see here, this is one of my favorite things about the domino. With a little bit of setup there, it makes things super, super repeatable, super accurate. And these things were nice and flush, front and back, top and bottom. Things worked out really well. So put my dominoes in, went ahead and put some glue in, set these things in clamps, and again, nice finger-tight pressure here, nothing too crazy. Now, I just mentioned I like to batch tasks together whenever possible, and I knew that I was taking my cabinet doors over to the drum sander once they were out of clamps just to flush everything up. That's a standard step that I follow whenever I'm making any kind of cabinet doors like that. So I also knew I wanted to use the drum sander for the top. So here I got a couple of pieces of maple milled up, glued them together, and had my top all glued up and ready to go for when it was time to head to the drum sander. So you can see over here, setting things through the drum sander, I go ahead, I've got a little bit of glue squeeze out there. I don't take a ton of time trying to get that off. I get as much as I can off when the glue first tacks up. When I put glue in a glue up like this, I let it tack up for about anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, depending on the glue. And I come back with a chisel to get as much out as possible, but there's always a little bit of glue squeeze out left. So I take that over to the drum sander, run that through. I've got 120 grit, and then on the second drum head, 150 grit here. And then I do the same thing for the face frames. And this just ensures that everything is nice and flush and a nice consistent thickness. Now, I'm going to be putting a piece of acrylic in here instead of glass, and so the next step was to go over and use the rabbiting bit at the router table to rabbit out the space for the acrylic to go in later. You can see here this rabbiting bit is from Infinity Tools, not sponsored by them, but it is a beast, and I love this thing. It gives me great results every time I use it. When you are operating inside of a workpiece like this, make sure that you are going the right direction. Remember that when you're using a router in general, you want the wood going against the direction of the bit, so I don't want the bit turning in the same direction I am feeding my workpiece. You can see there it leaves a little bit of a round over in the corners, but that is not a problem. I can come back later with some chisels and take care of that. That is easy. So next step was to head over to the drill press. Used a Forstner bit here, measured and marked out where I wanted my hinges to go. These are going to be Bloom cup hinges, and so I went ahead and cut those out. You can see here once I had those cut out, I went ahead and used these great auto-centering drill bits. I got these from Rockler, but a lot of different companies sell them. I use those just to chop in there directly and then come back with the screws to set things up. And again, these are Bloom soft close hinges. Now the next step, I mentioned I needed to address those rounded corners. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a chisel and I'm using the inside face of that rabbet to just make a reference line on both sides that I know I need to cut to. I'm then using a 90-degree corner chisel to hog out most of the material. Now, I've talked to a couple of my friends who are big into hand tools and are what I would consider obviously much more of an expert in hand tools than I am. And a lot of folks think these 90-degree chisels are kind of a hack thing and that you don't really need them, and that's probably fair. As someone who doesn't use hand tools a lot, I love them. I think they're fantastic. So I went ahead and did that on all 8 corners. And then next up was cutting out the acrylic. Now, I've cut acrylic before at the table saw with a just combination blade to kind of varying success. A lot of chip out and tear out. So I actually purchased a blade that was made specifically for plastics and acrylic. I believe it was 80 tooth. Went ahead and cut to width, and then I'm using my crosscut sled here to cut it to the correct height. And I was really impressed with this, and I think this is another one of those examples that there's always a way to kind of jerry-rig something, but there's no substitute for having the right tool for the job. It made this really quick, really painless. So before I started the final sanding and finishing process, I wanted to install all of my hardware. These Bloom hinges are designed specifically for face-framed cabinets. So you got a nice shot there of the back of my head screwing the cabinet hardware in. There it is again. You can see I'm wearing a hat. Need a haircut back there. But great views of my head aside, it's important to pre-install all of your hardware to make everything work. You don't want to rush that step, skip it, and then wind up having to fix something after you've already got finish on there. So while I was doing all this and setting things up, I decided to make the shelves that were going to go in. You saw me drill the shelf pins earlier. Now I'm using iron-on edge banding, and you can see here, one of the things I found that helps with iron-on edge banding is using something to kind of burnish it once you've heated it up, with a big focus on the edges there. If that stuff is going to lift up, it is going to curl up at the edges. Once that all dries, I come back with these clippers. They clip off the end piece of this. Works really well. There's cooler options out there, and I would love to have some of the cooler options, but that's what I got for now. And then I use this trimmer just to trim and flush up the edges. We'll come back, hit it with a little bit of sandpaper. And again, this is maple iron-on edge banding to match these maple shelves. The birch side of these is going to be facing down. That was one thing where I was going to have some birch, but it's downward facing. You're not going to see it anyway. So I mentioned before I was going to put that hard maple top on there. I needed a way to attach this. What I'm doing here is drilling through, and you can see just in the top of the screen there where the clamp is, I have a piece of plywood backing this so that I don't get blowout. And what I'm doing is using a drill bit that is bigger than the screw itself. So the screw itself is not going to have any sort of bite at all into the plywood top, or the plywood inside, I should say, of the top of this top portion of the cabinet. It will float freely in there, and it will only attach and actually bite into the maple hardwood. What that does is it allows for some wiggle room for wood movement over the course of time. This gym that it's going into is heated in the winter, but not air conditioned in the summer, so this will see a fair amount of wood movement, and I wanted to make sure to account for that. Now next was an infinite amount of sanding, and as you can see here, I managed to not get a clip of myself cutting and installing that 1/4 inch back panel, but you can see there I screwed that in, and you can see how it sits flush with that overhang that I left, and hopefully that makes a little bit more sense now. I sanded up to 150, and as for the finish, it was time for Rubio Monocoat. Now, there's a lot of different finishes that you can use, obviously. Rubio has become, over time, kind of my go-to finish and one of my favorite finishes to use. One of the big reasons for that is the ease of application in a dusty shop. If you work in a garage wood shop or a small wood shop like me where you don't have room for a spray booth, you're working on multiple projects at once, you're trying to be efficient, you don't have the time to put the shop out of commission for a week to try to get some spray-on finish done perfectly. And I've done spray-on finishes in the shop before when I was working on a single project. But the nice thing about Rubio is I can apply it, I can set it off to the side, and it bonds to the wood. It's not going to collect all the dust. I come back 10-15 minutes later, wipe off all the excess after it's been troweled in and buffed, and then, like I mentioned, it just doesn't trap all that dust. So it's a really nice way to get a nice dust-free finish application and allow your garage shop to still operate if you are so inclined to do multiple projects at once. Now, once that was all finished, it was time for all the finishing touches, so it was time to install these acrylic panels into the cabinet doors. And what you see me using here is what is called a point driver. I'll have a link to this if you go to the description of the video. We actually have an Amazon storefront where any of the tools that you see in this project are available for you to check out and buy. Buying from that site actually helps us out a little bit. If you do picture frames, this is a great tool. It drives a little metal nib into the side of the wood there. Now these overlapped a little bit and were visible from the front, so I came back with, that is actually a fret cutter that I use for guitar making, but I cut a little bit of the metal off and then came back with a file and just filed off any sharp points. I installed the cabinet hinges again here, and then it was time to start putting everything together. Once I got the hinges installed, you can see I put the hardware back into the cabinet itself, and I'm sorry that is not a shot of my head. I wasn't wearing a hat this time. It would have been a different angle, but I decided to actually show you the hardware itself this time. So you've seen me do this before on other furniture builds. I like to take my top, turn it upside down, and then set the piece on top of that, and use a ruler to measure out the edges, make sure that everything is nice and even where I want it to be. Some of this is just eyeballing, but you actually do want to be as precise as possible, or maybe you don't. I don't know how anal you are. Now, a lot of times in this situation, you will see me use a center punch, and unfortunately, this was too deep for the center punches I had. So another great trick for doing this sort of thing, marking the locations of your holes, is just take a screw and a hammer, a couple light taps, and that is going to get you what you need. And again, as usual, you can see I set a tape marker on my drill to just make sure I don't drill through the top of the top. That would just be disastrous at this point. So went ahead and installed the screws, and that is going to be a wrap for this project. Now, if you guys are interested in seeing more videos like this, then the channel has a bunch of other great furniture builds, and I would love it if you enjoyed this video in any way. If you learned something, I would hope that I earned your subscription and that you go and subscribe to the channel. Like, leave a comment, let me know what you think. Have any questions or concerns, you can leave them down there. There's links to all of our affiliates. Again, if you buy anything from the Amazon store or from MagSwitch, that helps us make more of this content for you. I love making content, and any help you are willing to provide is something that we truly do appreciate. So that's a wrap for this. Putting on the handles, getting everything done, and it turned out really, really well. The client was pretty happy with it. It is in use at the gym, and you can see some glamour shots here. At the end of the day, the client seemed quite happy with it. That's always the most important thing. So hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Make sure to check out some of our other videos, and until next time, get out there and enjoy your garage.